Hi, this is Piros for Programming Duck, and welcome back to another video. This video is about how to apply accessibility as you work. So as usual, before we start this, a legal disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. This article only represents my personal opinion and current understanding. It is not legal advice. Please consult a lawyer for information on the legal aspects of accessibility. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get started. So ensuring that your web content is accessible doesn't have to be difficult, okay? This is what we're going to look at in this video. It shouldn't take you a lot of work to do it correctly. There are just a few things you need to do in your day-to-day development, and here they are. The simple process is something like this. First of all, learn about your legal accessibility requirements. Use semantic HTML. Check accessibility checklists frequently to ensure you've applied accessibility correctly in your work. And fourth, test your website's accessibility, because as with anything, you have to test your work. You have to test that you're doing it correctly. Now, those are probably good enough, but if you want to take it even further, you can do something like these as well. Make accessibility part of the standards and the development process in your company. Educate people about accessibility, and if you need more help, hire some specialists to help you out. Okay, so let's go over each one of these one by one. So first of all, legal requirements. Okay, so different countries have different legal requirements about accessibility. Those are not optional, right? If something is a legal requirement, you have to do it. Otherwise, there might be consequences. So in general, in my current understanding, to be legally safe, to be legally compliant, you need to meet the WCAG, the latest specification, which at the time of recording this video, it's 2.1. That's WCAG 2.1. Level AA accessibility standards, okay? So there are three levels. There is A, that's single A, double A, and triple A, okay? So from what I understand, to meet the legal requirement, you need to meet the latest published specification, double A. Single A is not good enough. And AAA is great if you can meet it, but it's not a legal requirement. And finally, depending on which country you're in, you may need an accessibility statement on your website. And even if you don't need one by law, it's good to have one anyway. So yeah, I've listed some resources in the slides. Please feel free to have a look at those, to figure out this information. All right, so next. The next point is to use semantic HTML, okay? Because as we've said in some of the previous videos, semantic HTML is basically 80% of what you need to do regarding accessibility. If you use semantic HTML properly, you've done the majority of the work that you need to do about accessibility, and your customers are going to be happy and they can use your website properly. So do that, okay? I'm not going to list resources here because semantic HTML is something you should know how to do anyway, but you know the resources, right? You have MDN, you have basic courses and things like that. All right, so next, use useful checklists. So these are really awesome because you can do your work, and then you can open up a checklist and okay, have I done this? Have I done that? Have I done that? Great, right? Have I not done this? Okay, no problem. It tells you what you need to do, how to do it, and you just go and do it and you're happy, right? And this takes minutes to do as you develop. Like checking a checklist takes you minutes. Doing the work, the majority of the time, takes you minutes as well. Accessibility work, in my experience, isn't very heavy, so to speak. So this is really good to do. And now there are a few checklists that you can use. I'll just go over them quickly. So one of them is the WebAIM WCAG checklist, and it provides great recommendations on the most important things you can do for accessibility, and it's also one of the simplest checklists in this section, and it's also personally my favorite. So because it's so simple and because it's so good, I recommend referring to this one basically very often. The next resource, this one isn't really a checklist, but the next resource is the WAI-ARIA authoring practices document. So this one is essential to refer to anytime you make a custom JavaScript widget. So those are things like a custom dropdown, an accordion, the thing like you click the button and it expands content, right? So those kinds of things, you must ensure that they're accessible. And this document tells you how to do that. So yeah, whenever you work on something like that, refer to this document. In addition to that, this resource provides additional guidance on basically naming elements, let's call it, having text content associated with elements. And some elements require a name, but some others don't require a name, but it's recommended that they have one anyway, okay? So at least in my experience, the elements that require a name, at least according to this resource, will get one if you use semantic HTML. For example, if you have an input field, semantic HTML requires you to have a label for it. And if you have that label, then the input field will have text content associated with it that you can read to the screen reader. So if you use semantic HTML, I don't believe that it's necessary for you to look at this resource, at least not very often. But regardless, this resource provides additional guidance and recommendations. And those are recommendations, they're not requirements. And those recommendations may not all be met if you're just using semantic HTML. So consider this resource optional. If you want to improve the experience of your screen reader users even more, then please have a look. If you just want to be compliant, then I don't think you need to look at this very often. Maybe look at it once in a while to make sure you're not missing anything or something like that. And finally, you have the official WCAG specification. So WCAG has a couple of documents, and to make sure that you're 100% legally compliant, you have to check against this one. Like, for example, the WebAIM resource is good to work from, but this is the one that decides whether you've done it correctly or not the other one, Unfortunately, at least in my personal opinion, this resource is much more difficult to work from than the others. So feel free to work off this one if that's what you would prefer. But for example, what I do is the majority of the time, I use the WebAIM resource, the first of the checklists that we spoke about. And I only use this one once in a blue moon, whenever I want to do a more comprehensive audit of the accessibility of my website. But I don't use this one in my day-to-day work. It's up to you, of course. You can do that if you'd prefer. But yeah, that's what I prefer. And lastly, how often should you check these checklists? Well, it's up to you, So you have different options. One of the things you can do, and that might be good to do, is you can refer to them every time you know you're working on something relevant, right? So if you're working on a custom JavaScript widget, check the WAI-ARIA resource. If you're working on navigation, scan through the WebAIM resource and make sure that your links and your navigations and stuff, that they're compliant. But other than that, you can also check it once in a while, whenever you want. Think of it like a mini audit of the accessibility of your website. So for example, you can go through the WebAIM resource and the WAI-ARIA resource, say once a week, or maybe once a month, or maybe every 6 months. You can go through them like properly, really, really thoroughly, So it's up to you. But yeah, what I like to do is go through them when I know I'm working on something relevant, and also go through them once in a while, like maybe once every 2 weeks, just as a sanity check that I've done accessibility correctly on my website. So the next point is that you need to test. As with anything, you have to test your work. And with accessibility, there are different kinds of things that you can test. You can do manual testing of accessibility, which is very good. And you can also do some automated testing. And finally, you can either use like third-party things to test for you. Okay. But let's start with some of the manual tests. So some things that you should consider testing manually are things like zoom, screen readers, keyboard navigation and interactivity, vision deficiencies, and the document outline. Okay, so think of those kind of like the design, like the user experience, but not visually, right? For people with certain disabilities. So those are things that, in my opinion, need to be tested manually. You need to make sure that the flow of how those users interact with the website makes sense. So the first one of those is Zoom. Okay, so WCAG currently requires that your website, your web pages, are usable at 200% zoom. So you can consider that a legal requirement. But of course, feel free to test higher than that. Okay, so what you would do is you would go through the pages on your website, and maybe you don't go through all of them. Maybe you go through a few until you have confidence that your website is accessible. Or maybe you just do the ones you're working on right now, and you increase the zoom and you see how it looks. Does it still look as it should? And optionally, if you want to take it further, you may consider testing with the no S level zoom, an operating system zoom setting, right? Not the browser zoom. And if you want to take it even further than that, you can download an application like Zoom Text or some alternative and test with that as well, because these are all things that your users may use. Next is screen readers. And screen readers are very important and very common for a lot of users. So it's highly recommended that you test your web pages with screen readers. And what that means is that, as we alluded to earlier, you don't look at your website, you just try to navigate your website using only a screen reader, okay? So there are different screen readers you can try and you can download, and a lot of them are free, so no worries there. Yeah, just pick one and go testing. But if you want to be even more thorough, you may consider testing some common pairings of operating system, screen reader, and browser. For example, things like what are on this slide, like Mac or iOS with VoiceOver and Safari, Windows with JAWS or NVDA, Chrome OS with Chromevox and Chrome as the browser, Android with accessibility options enabled and Chrome as the browser, and things like that. I think you get the idea. So next, keyboard navigation and interactivity. Because again, this is one of the common ways that a lot of users interact with your website. You need to use your website without touching the mouse and seeing if you can do everything you need to just with the keyboard. And an especially tricky one is custom JavaScript widgets. If you have a custom dropdown, is it usable with a keyboard? If you have a lot of links on the navigation bar, does the user have to spend 3 minutes tabbing through them until they get to the main content? Those kinds of things. And these are things that you have to test out manually. Okay, so yeah, just do that. Make sure that the keyboard navigation on your website is sensible, easy, and clear. The user must always know where they are, right? You don't want to tab and you don't see an outline somewhere, because that means you don't know where the user is. And a lot of websites suffer from this problem. And I hope you can imagine that can be quite frustrating. So yeah, test keyboard navigation and interactivity. And the next point is vision deficiencies. Now, browsers are awesome, okay? And I think both Firefox and Chrome provide a vision simulator. So that means you can go to some setting, and I've got some links for this in the slides, but you can do some setting in the browser in like the developer tools which simulate vision deficiencies. So you can you can simulate green-red color blindness, and it makes both of those look the same color. That's when you get to see how people with different vision deficiencies experience your content, which is great. So yeah, have a look. And if there are any major red flags, obviously you can fix them. And finally, we have the document outline. So hopefully you know about this already, because I believe this is an HTML thing. But it's the headings of your web page, right? So you start with an H1, then you go to an H2, and then you can't jump down more than one level, right? So you can't jump from an H2 to an H4. You can go from H2 to H3, right? Then you can have another H3, another H3. You can go back up to an H2, or you can be at an H3, go to an H4, and go back up to an H2. So you can jump up multiple levels, but you can't jump down multiple levels, things like that. So yeah, an HTML thing. Make sure you've tested that. You can either look at your source code yourself, or you can use tools that look at it for you. So you don't have to browse through and see, okay, let me find a heading. Okay, here it is. 1,000 more lines of source code. Let me find another heading. No, you can use a tool that just grabs the headings and shows them to you. Okay, so that covers the user experience manual tests, let's say. But there are more tools you can use, things that aren't necessarily as manual, things like this. So as briefly mentioned, you can use a third-party service like tenon.io, I believe it is. And there are many more. So if you want to delegate some of the accessibility work to something else, this is one of your options. And other than that, you can test individual pages for accessibility. One example tool that you can use is the Chrome developer tools. Okay, it gives you a lot of useful things. The big one is Lighthouse. So if you open the Chrome developer tools on your browser, you go to Lighthouse, which does audits, and one of the audits is for accessibility. And that's really good. You can do that audit, and it's going to give you things that you can improve on or that aren't compliant with a lot of detail, and then you can go and fix them. So this is pretty good. And they give you other things as well. So they have this feature called the accessibility tab in Chrome developer tools, which is basically like the DOM, but for accessibility instead. It's like the accessibility tree. And you can see for every element what kind of text content it's got associated with it and things like that. This one may be a little bit advanced, but it's there, So if you need it, if you want something like that, it's there. Feel free to use it. And the vision deficiency simulator that we talked about, that's in the rendering tab specifically. And I use Chrome myself, so I haven't used Firefox a lot, but I'm confident in saying that Firefox has similar features for accessibility work. Another thing is browser extensions. So there are some really good ones that are very commonly used. For example, one of them is the Wave extension. Again, you click on that and it scans your page or something, and it tells you, look, you're failing here, improve it in X and Y ways, So these are very helpful tools to help you. And I've got a few more, again, in the slides. So have a look. They're very good. Finally, you can get build tools, like things that you run as part of your build system. So for example, Lighthouse, you can run it in Node. So, automated accessibility tests, that's pretty good. If you have any new errors that you didn't have last time, it tells you, and you get the idea. And there are many more as well. You have Axe Core, Cypress Axe, Accessibility.js, and whatever else. And then finally, you can get linters for your programming language. So for example, if you use React, or more appropriately, JSX, you have the package ESLint plugin JSX A11Y. So, a linter for accessibility. So you have a lot of tools at your disposal. All right, so another thing that you can do, if you feel like you need to, is you can actually have unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests for accessibility as well. For example, I don't know, say you've created a custom JavaScript widget and you want to test that the focus and the keyboard navigation for it works correctly. You can write an end-to-end test for that. So, as long as that end-to-end test passes, you're always confident that it does indeed work correctly. And you can do whatever you want, right? If you know how to test, you can test anything you like. So that's coming to the end of this section, the testing section, which was really long, actually. It took quite a while. So to summarize, here are some recommendations of how you can get started if you're not sure what you want to start with. So firstly, I would recommend to keep things simple. Use Lighthouse. Use Google Lighthouse, the Google developer tools. Run an audit and fix whatever it's telling you to fix. It's very comprehensive and it's very good. That will take you a long way for accessibility work. And the second thing is do some manual testing, as we said, for keyboard navigation, screen readers, the document outline, and zoom. So you can start with just those. Then, later on, as you get more comfortable with testing accessibility, try installing something like the Wave browser extension or an alternative, and checking what that tells you on every page. Or you can set up some automated accessibility testing with Lighthouse or Xcore or some other build tool. Or you can try installing some relevant code linters, like we saw with the ESLint plugin JSX A11T, right? And things like that. So start simple and build up as you feel you need to or as you feel it would be helpful. And finally, if you don't want to do that work yourself, you can also use a third-party service like Tenon.io or any other alternative. All right, so that's the end of the testing section. We can finally move on to the next one. And that is, why not make accessibility a standard and a part of your development process, right? And this is similar to how you might have any processes in your work, in your company. You know, you have a standard that says code should be sufficiently decoupled, and you have ways to enforce that. You have a standard that says code should have this styling, and again, you have ways to enforce that. And if it goes through code review and it doesn't comply with that, someone brings it up and you fix it, right? So it becomes part of your standards, which means that you do it every time, which is good, right? Because making sure your website is accessible consistently is much better than you having to fix every accessibility issue like every 6 months or something. I hope that makes sense, right? So yeah, you know, and you may have it as part of your standards. You may say, well, all work has to meet the WebAIM guidelines, right, from that useful checklist, and also the ARIA authoring practices. And you can check that in code review. And then you can also make it part of your development process, right? And you can do anything, but for example, you might do things like set up automated accessibility tests to be run on the pull request for every story. You could require developers to test the accessibility of their work before they submit a feature. Or you could run a small accessibility audit once a month, or maybe a comprehensive audit once a year. You know, whatever it is, anything you want to do. These are just some examples. All right, so next point, educate people whose work ends up on the front end. As explained in some of the previous videos, front-end developers affect accessibility the most. That means that essentially it's your responsibility to know about accessibility. But it's not just you that affects the accessibility of your website. Anyone whose work ends up on the front end can affect the accessibility, like for example, designers or content creators, okay? So one good thing to do is to educate them. You can educate them and tell them, yo, look, this is what we need to do for good accessibility. Please make sure you're doing these things, right? Or you can even work with them to set up standards in their work for good accessibility. For example, if you have a copywriter, and the copywriter is someone who writes text on the website, you may tell them, look, your work needs to follow a reasonable document outline. Please, when you complete your work, make sure that you scan through the headings and you see, do they have a sequential order? You can help them, collaborate with them to set up standards like that with them. And finally, the last point, and we're done with the points, is if you need even more help, you can hire third-party accessibility consultants. So the entire point of this video is so that you can do the accessibility work yourself. So you might be thinking, why does the company need to hire more people? And that's a valid thought if you're thinking that. But the point is, we're developers. We're not accessibility specialists. And not all of our focus and energy is on accessibility. So we might miss something, Even if we try our hardest, we might miss something. And even if we're legally compliant, the specialists may know more about how, look, this isn't required, but consider adding this feature because it's nice to have. They're specialists. They have more experience and more knowledge than us. So yeah, you may hire them anyway. And if the accessibility standard in your work isn't sufficient yet, for whatever reason, maybe it's building up to it, you may hire them anyway to help with that. All right, so that's it. That's all the points. All that's left now is to summarize. So very simply, accessibility work doesn't have to be difficult. In fact, for you as a front-end developer or as someone who works on the front end, it should only take you minutes of your time, something like that, to make sure that your work is accessible consistently. Now, the simple process that you can use is something like this. First of all, you need to learn about your legal accessibility requirements. Secondly, use semantic HTML. Thirdly, check accessibility checklists frequently to ensure that you're doing your work correctly. And that is, you can check them as you're working on something, or you can check them once a week or once a month, or whatever you want. And fourth, test your website's accessibility to ensure you're doing it correctly. As with anything, you need to test your work. And we went through a few of the things that you can test. If you want to take it further, you can also do these things. You can make accessibility part of the standards and the development process in your company. You can educate and advise people on accessibility. And if you need more help, you can hire specialists. Okay, so that's it. That was quite a long video, but I really hope that you found it useful, and I hope it helps you with making sure that your work is accessible. Alright, so if you like this video, then please click the like button. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, then please subscribe. It really helps the channel when you do those things. And finally, as always, if you have any comments or any counter arguments or any suggestions or anything at all, then please leave a comment below. Alright, thanks very much and see you next time.